welcome to the very first episode of Let's Pick This Up Next Week, where you get to have a chat with your two best friends who happen to be therapists. My name is Dee. I use she, her pronouns. This is Sloopy back here, who's making a cameo today. And our lovely co-host is DJ, they, them pronouns.
Hi, everyone.
We're so stoked to break down each week different things that your therapist thinks about. And today we're talking about demystifying therapist lingo. So let me ask DJ, what's your favorite therapist phrase that you use?
Now it's let's pick this up. Let's pick this up next week. One of my favorites is how's that working for you?
That's one of my go-tos, because I think it's not condescending. It's really not. It depends on how you're saying it, but I don't know, it's how's that working for you? Is it working? Is it not working? I think it's an interesting. So how do you find that people respond to it or are confused by it? Because sometimes I've asked that question and people are blank slate,
I think a lot of times, one of the things that I do in my sessions a lot is give examples. And so I think if I take something that they say and then give an example and then say okay, so how's that been working for you? Then it gives them something to compare it to, and they'll be like, well, when you put it like that, then I can see that it's not really working the way that I thought it was working.
That's true. Have you ever had someone say it's working just fine?
If they do, they don't usually mean it.
That's fair.
Right. They realize that it's not working just fine.
There's that protective rationale of
Yeah.
I think one of the favorite phrases that I learned from grad school that I've learned to use kind of intermittently is what's that about for you?
Oh yeah, that's a good one
and
too.
I find people can kind of be confused about it. So if I kind of rephrase it to say so when you act this way or you respond this way to people in your life, what's that about for you? What comes up for you when you do that?
Yeah, what comes up for you is one that I use with the therapist that I supervise as well. And sometimes I find out that with the therapist that I supervise, when I'll ask what came up for you then, when I'm talking about countertransference, a lot of times they don't want to see their countertransference. So they'll say, nothing came up for me.
So, and you just name dropped another one of those terms that's I think as therapists, we know a lot of these random terms and we say it to our clients or our people that we're working with. And I think in general, we've become as a society more accustomed to using different terms, and even then just countertransference.
Right.
That's a weird, I don't know that non-therapists ever use that term in their daily life.
Right. I noticed that it's coming up in social work practice too. They're talking about countertransference. So a little bit different and, what that relationship is, but it can come up and I guess anywhere where you have two people who are interacting in a professional relationship, a professional sort of therapeutic with social workers.
Just even any didactic anything.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's a whole other thing. I wonder. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, now I'm thinking of I've definitely said to people because I happen to be that very type A, unfortunately a know-it-all that I'm really trying not to be. But I've told people you're parentifying me, you're requiring that I take care of you because I'm naturally someone who's I will step up, I will take care, I will do these things, and I hate it. I hate it.
You hate that relationship where you feel that you have to take that role. That reminded me of learned helplessness of other people.
That is true. Yeah, if it's someone else is going to do it, then why should I even try?
Yeah. We can go into a whole topic with that.
Even now, do you notice as a therapist or as a person in the world that you respond like a therapist? Because even right now, we've been friends for over a decade, and you're giving me a lot of the mm-hms and yeahs and all the things that we do as therapists.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you have to be aware of that and how much you do it. Because I have had clients say to me that when you're and yeah and nodding that you're doing that an awful lot. Are you sure your head's not going to fall off? But so you have to make sure that you're not doing that too much.
There's definitely that weird balance, and I feel like it's like a tick almost. I've
Uh-huh.
definitely people in my
Yeah.
real life tell me like, stop therapizing me, like don't listen like this.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay,
That's
I forget
taken
that.
that's taken some work to like not do that, and it definitely takes work to not do that with your friends. Like I really try and step out of like not, and I think maybe sometimes I go on the other direction because I'll just be like, that sounds really rough. To make sure that I'm not giving too much analytical advice if when not asked for.
Mm. Yeah,
Hmm.
I've definitely
Or
had people
spend
in my
the
life
energy
that
doing it. Yeah.
spend the energy doing what?
Trying to, like if someone that's close to you is telling you like what's going on, and trying to, like doing the automatic, like that's because this, that's because that, that's because this. I like really try to just like listen to what they're saying and not go any too much deeper than that. Like let them
That's
come to
fair.
the conclusions on their own.
I tend to ask people like, do you need a free therapist for a bit, or
Hmm.
do you need a friend who has a personal stake in your well-being?
Yeah. Yeah, I usually what I've started to do now is wait till they ask. So like,
Mm,
they'll be like, "Hey, can I have your professional opinion?" So most people will like come to me for that, and and I wait. Like otherwise I'll be like, that's really, oh wow, that's really stressful.
sometimes I forget how to not have conversations like that. It's awful. So
Right,
a lot of
yeah.
times too, I find like
It
I'm
takes work.
bringing certain. It does. It's almost
Mhm.
like this code switching, and I certainly don't mean
Mhm.
to appropriate that language in any way. It's just this idea of like, this is how I act as a person. This is how I
Mhm.
act in like my work persona, which is different
Mhm.
because as a director, I still do therapy, and when I'm in my therapist
Mhm.
hat, here's where I'm at. And when I'm in, director role or supervisor role or whatever, it's very different.
Mhm.
Although recently one of the folks that I work with on my team tells me that it's really hard when I like sit down with them and I want to know how they're doing as people. I know they're going through something. And so I'll say something just like, how are you doing? And one of my
Mhm.
staff people's just like, you can't do that at work. Like I just start
Mhm.
crying. Like it's just like, I'm like,
You're
I don't
right.
mean to do
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
care about
Yeah.
you.
Right, it is, and it is balancing and like the difference between like supervision, since we're both directors, versus like, what you're doing in the relationship, the therapeutic relationship um, with your clients. Like you still want to have empathy and understanding with the people that you're supervising, but also like, you have to be able to put more responsibility and yeah, responsibility on them, I think, to like, again, do more of their problem solving without as much suggestions from you.
That's fair. I think it's based on who you're working with. Because I right now, I've had for a very long time, I've had a mix of very seasoned therapists, people who have been doing this
Hmm.
a long time. And so like they
Yeah.
don't have, that transference to me that they see me as a counselor. I think a lot of times it's they see me now that I'm not like young. um, a lot of my team is younger than me, which is so
Hmm.
weird.
Yeah.
Uh, so to be in that space where I'm like, yeah, like they don't, personify me as their own therapist. They're not bringing things to me like that.
Right.
They're seeing me as clinical supervisor or whatever my role of that day
Right.
is. Versus I think the new ones are more likely to say, I don't know if you heard my dog, so I'm going to
I've
start that
heard
one
it. Yeah.
again.
Hmm.
And I forgot what I was already saying.
You said, I know the new ones look at me to say,
So I know the new ones look at me to say and to solve them and things like that. And I
hmm.
want to jump in and be like, do you realize like this is what you're doing? Like when you do that
Hmm.
thing, like this is the need you're trying to get met.
Yeah,
So,
it can be hard to like not do that. I have to remind myself not to be their therapist, because I know some people in the personal stuff they're going through, and I know how it is impacting their therapy, and I know how there's the countertransference. So I try to like make sure that like I am pointing out when countertransference is without therapizing what they're going through.
mhm,
Like I think there might be some countertransference coming up because just maybe what's happening in your life,
mhm.
without going into like, let's talk about what's happening in your life, because now we're probably not going to do that much.
That's fair.
I think like as a supervisor is that balance. Like you want your team, especially as therapists, we want our team to be able to have space to like talk about maybe what's happening in their personal life, but also having to remember that our role is a supervisor and we can't therapize them.
Which is sometimes very difficult because I think a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
get in the field because they are broken people who have hopefully
Mm-hmm.
healed. And I know, like,
Yeah,
I'm trying not to make a
hopefully.
generalization that I can't also apply
Mm-hmm.
to, is like, I definitely was interested in psychology because of life experience. And
For sure.
uh, a lot of times when I do interviews with oncoming counselors, we talk about like what motivates you. And a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
this is like question 2 on the interview, by the way, go right into, well, this was, my dad or my mom or my cousin. And I'm like, that's super, super important.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's great, but have you
Mm-hmm.
worked on the healing
Right.
side so you don't have that countertransference and you don't look at
Exactly. Right.
your people like these other people in your life?
Right. And with the countertransference, that's the biggest thing that I tell like my team when they're having it. Like if there's something that is going on in your life and you haven't worked through it, then like sometimes it's good if you have that come up with a client and to be like, hey, this is something that's happening for me right now. So we're probably not going to go as deep into that to make sure that like I don't have my own emotions and feelings come up. And acknowledging that like, hey, we're humans too, understanding that countertransference can happen and how can you avoid it while also helping them process. But
That's
a lot of times people they don't do that, and then they're just getting their selves involved too much.
That's an interesting approach because I've always taken the
Hmm.
approach of that, like, whatever we're struggling with normally ends across the table from us, or ends,
Hmm.
up in our client chair, because of course it does. That's how the universe works. It's
Hmm.
calling upon us to work on ourselves constantly, unfortunately,
Hmm.
which is
Hmm.
difficult. So I don't think I've ever
Hopefully.
had a conversation with a client that says, like, I can't dive deeper. It's just, I've always just taken it to my supervisor and been like, what do I do? How do I manage my own stuff that comes up?
Yeah, and I think it is like making sure because like, I think like I do take my people pretty deep and can go pretty deep with them. And like, as an EMDR trained therapist and stuff like that's definitely like something that I do. But and they're gonna know if like I'm not like we're not going there as much because like also I just want to make sure that like my bias or blind spots aren't getting in the way right then. So then I'm gonna go work
Mm.
on that and think about it and process through before I go there with, but I think that it depends on your approach with there's a couple of approaches, right? To acknowledge that, hey, I know that I'm a human going through this. It depends on how much you want to self-disclose and how comfortable you are doing that. But there is research that says that acknowledging to your clients that countertransference, that that it happens, that that it could happen, can actually be beneficial for the therapeutic relationship. And I have found it to be beneficial in the work that I'm doing with my clients. But there's very, very different approaches depending on what you're comfortable with.
For sure. And I think, like, I'm just a super private person, but I
Mm.
also work with a very different audience than you do.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, I
Mm-hmm.
happen to work with people who are very justice involved, or
Mm-hmm.
there's that, like, working in jails and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Like, I don't have a single picture in my office of people that I love and care about. And,
Mm-hmm.
like, that's
Mm-hmm.
just not what I bring. And I
Right.
realize, like, that's also a shortcoming that I have, is I don't lean into that at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it really is depending on, what you feel is appropriate, how you can manage it, and what you feel about like your own personal comfort and safety. Yeah.
We've hit on
Yeah. Go ahead.
So we've
Go
hit on
ahead.
so many different, like, terms, and I think of,
Try.
like,
Yes.
the terms that I think, again, that we use that are just so strange. Like, to me, one of my go-to kind uh of my personal philosophy of counseling, the things that cause us distress are feeling incongruence and dissonance. And if
Mm.
you haven't been to therapy, those words are very
Mm-hmm.
strange. But that experience of congruence, of feeling that you're genuinely living your values, I
Mm-hmm.
find is really, really helpful when we're breaking down, like, why are you feeling this way? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you dealing with? Chances are it's because you feel that split, right? You're feeling
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that dissonance between who you are and what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that and thinking about authenticity. And I love on power of vulnerability to help my patients, work through like dissonance and being able to show up as themselves. But yeah, that's super like, ideal self versus like your authentic self and like knowing like, can you show up as you?
Mhm.
Hmm.
We do a lot of in one of the like curriculums we do talks about like inside outside. So,
Hmm.
the classic, you draw the inside. What are you showing or if you're doing the outside world, it's typically like a house or something, or even just a
Hmm.
list if someone's not feeling like they can tap into that side of creativity. What are the things you show the outside world? You show things like I'm strong, you show things like I'm smart, I'm capable, I am someone who is passionate, I'm someone who values XYZ, I'm hardworking, I'm whatever. And then you kind of flip over that page and you draw what does the inside of that house look like? What are you actually dealing with? And so those might be things of I'm feeling insecure. I'm feeling that I don't have the value that I show the world. I'm feeling like
Hmm.
I'm even going so far as to say like I'm worthless. I'm unworthy of what I've achieved or whatever that might be.
Right.
And then discuss the dissonance between the two. Like, how does that feel to feel like you're walking around having to pretend to be this that you're not? Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
really hard.
And exhausting, I think. And I think that's, one of the biggest things that, that is like a term that is in therapy a lot today is vulnerability. And I think like, you and I were at a conference recently where we presented and, in all the spaces I was in, I would, tell people what my barriers were. And, one of the things that I would say is I recently like found out that I'm autistic and explain like how I might experience something different than somebody else. And I think that like it gave people an awareness of like, what it's like to work with like neurodivergent clients as well. But also one of the things that people would keep saying to me is how brave I was
Hmm.
saying that like I'm trans or that I'm autistic or that, any of the things, ADHD, any of the things. I'm like, it shouldn't be brave. It's vulnerability, and vulnerability should be something that we accept in the society.
For everyone else but me, I do.
Hmm.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah.
It was interesting. At that conference was probably the first conference that when people got up and introduced themselves, because normally people
Hmm.
introduce based on their professional credentials, right? So I'd say,
Yeah.
I'm Dee, this is my license, this is how I'm
Hmm.
doing this is my job, these are all these titles that I have that are these outside titles, these things that feel safe and
Hmm.
comfortable. But what I
Right.
saw a lot at the conference was more of the, you know, uh, I went to one session where people talked about their levels of privilege to say, I'm a homeowner, but
Mm-hmm.
this, like, I don't often think about things of like, I know I have privilege. It just feels weird to
Hmm.
talk about it in that
Hmm.
space. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
like, I was excited for them, but the idea of me doing it myself made me so uncomfortable.
So yeah, uncomfortable and scary. It's like all the shields that, you put up. It's interesting because also in the Counseling Today, magazine, whatever that comes with, if you belong to the ACA, right? They send you the Counseling Today every
The
so often.
American
The
Counseling
topic.
Association.
Yes,
Yes.
the cover topic is imposter syndrome, and imposter syndrome in therapists and counselors. So, thinking about the fact that like what we think we have to do because if we don't, then someone might think that we are like an imposter. So I think that that conference you went to, wasn't it like Back to the Basics, or that was like a big part of the
I thought the
what was
theme
the
was
title of
diversity
it?
and culture,
Diversity. I feel like there was like maybe there was a workshop that I went to was like talking about like back to
probably.
the basics, yeah. And
Yeah.
I think thinking about like authenticity is like we're just people having conversations like
Yes.
with our patients or clients or as well.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that kind of art of being a trained conversationalist almost.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's one more thing I want to pick your brain on.
Yeah.
Uh, what are your thoughts on the DSM?
The DSM. What I think about the DSM, first of all, like, I missed the DSM-4 and the changes I with the DSM-5, like, are like,
What?
yes, I do. I think that
Name
like,
one thing you liked about the 4 more than the
oh
5.
gosh.
If we have to find things we like about the DSM.
Yeah, I think part of me still likes the axes. And I think the reason why I think is because, the way the insurance companies work, I think there's so many things that like, you know, basically we can just have everyone anxiety and depression, and like that's all anybody cares about. We're not like going deeper. But I think that like when we talked about like autism and taking out like Asperger's, I think a lot of people get there's already under diagnosis. I think that happens with like neurodivergent people, and I think a lot of times that makes it an even bigger barrier. I can't think. I wasn't prepared to think about all the things but I know like it'll come up and I'll be like, oh, okay, I hate this about the 5. And so there is like a few other things. I do like that, gender dysphoria versus gender identity disorder, which it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, there's some things that I like better, but other things I'm like, I don't know. I don't like those changes as much.
Here was the interesting thing in all you said.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing had to do with patient care.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Right.
nothing. Using the
Yeah.
axes, for example, totally insurance based. Like
It is, and
I mean,
that's yeah. Go ahead.
I think going to the 5, first off, I
Mm-hmm.
hate the DSM. I'm one of
Yeah.
those like free therapy for everybody. Why do I have to diagnose the human
Right.
condition
You're
for
right.
somebody
Yeah.
to pay for someone so that I can, I don't know, like get food and have a house? Like that's weird to me. But I think the 4 to the 5 really made a lot of differences when you talk about, of course, like gender dysphoria. I do a lot in addiction diagnoses, and the 4 looked at abuse and dependence, and those are very stigmatizing phrases. There was a lot of confusion about what it meant.
Right.
So I think moving from that to a spectrum-based disorder of mild, moderate to severe substance use disorder based on the criteria met makes way more sense, because they're not two like divergent things.
Because I have opposite, and the thing is like what I don't like. I don't use the DSM to pathologize, where I think a lot of professionals do. I think psychiatrists do. Like pathologize, medicate. I think that can happen with many, not all. And I think a lot of people use it to be like, especially personality disorders, it's like to pathologize. And this is a group I don't want to work with because it feels difficult. But when it comes to the substance abuse diagnoses, I think that I miss the differences between abuse and dependence, and only because when I've worked with people who are trying to like figure out like their own use of alcohol, who might not be dependent, for using like the
physically
old
dependent,
yes, or the old criteria and the DSM-4, but has already like, because we don't have that language or not using that language, or they're working with other professionals who aren't using that language. I think the difference between knowing what's abuse versus dependence is important. And like even how someone's trying to like look at like their own use and figure out what changes do they need to make. I've had people like, oh, like I'm a bad alcoholic and like all this, and we're going through like their, what their experiences are. And I'm like, well, if we still use the DSM-4, I would call it abuse. I wouldn't say that was alcohol dependence. Yeah.
So you almost use it to kind of lighten like the
stigma, the personal
around it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I think like, that's what I try and use. Like I use the DSM as a like understanding, to like for them to understand themselves, understand why, understand, how something might have happened. But I don't diagnose on criteria anyways. I've always diagnosed on patterns.
That's fair. Yeah. And I used to be so like, I remember like, going to grad school and being like, oh man, yes, this is going to be I'm going to figure out the puzzle of every person. Every person fits perfectly into these things. And I think too, like the DSM lacks, especially the 4, and it's getting better now that we're on the TR, the text revision of DSM-5, the cultural competency of things. So for example, like
good point.
With the substance, abuse to dependence and then switching over to the spectrum, one of the things that it did is it got rid of legal problems as a criteria, and legal problems inordinately affected Black and brown people than not. And so it's like, why are we pathologizing that like that criteria to say, hey, you happen to get caught doing this thing, so you have, it's more severe because, whatever, versus someone who didn't. That speaks of privilege, and
you're right.
So I didn't like that.
It is. Yeah. And I don't like it as a way to like pathologize. I like it as a way to give a framework of understanding, to be like, maybe these skills work or these strategies work, or this is a way that you can approach to like to help yourself versus like, a pathologize and like, oh, there's something wrong with you because of this criteria, but like, here's an understanding. This is why this is happening for you, and this is like ways that we know that help with these sets of problems.
Yeah, I think like it's good because you can find that community, right? So when
Right. Yeah.
I tell a client to say, hey, so what you're experiencing is really in line with the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. I think hearing BPD, which is not bipolar disorder, a lot of people
Right.
hear
A lot
like
of people do think
by
that. Yeah.
they mix them up. So when I say BPD, I mean borderline personality disorder. Some people hear that and they're like, oh my gosh, that must mean that I'm, this, irrational and emotionally driven person. And it doesn't always mean that, but I think that when I do provide that, hey, here's the symptoms that you're experiencing, it does
Right.
make it easier to find a community and to know the likeness and hear how other people are dealing with it in daily life.
Yeah. Yeah. When I look at the criteria and the symptoms, and I also like, this is why it's happened. Like normally, like this is the background, these are the reasons, especially with borderline personality disorder, because in our field, that's the one that is like, has the most stigma. I think that like when you would talk to other professionals about who they want to work with, and a lot of people will be like, I don't want to work with someone with borderline personality disorder, which is problematic in itself. But I think, giving the understanding of like, why did this happen? And I think the criteria might be able to help like give the framework for that.
That's fair. And it's adapting that language based on the person we're working with. So like
Exactly.
people I've treated,
Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of antisocial personality disorder folks, just again working in corrections and working people involved in the justice system.
Right, for sure. Yeah.
And so I see a lot of antisocial, but I've had people who just completely like, that is not a word they accept. And that's okay.
Same with
it helps my
borderline.
framework. Yeah, it helps my framework of, okay, what effective, culturally sensitive interventions am I going to choose for someone based on what their diagnoses is?
Right.
Diagnoses is whatever. Based on their diagnosis. End of sentence.
Right. Right. And I think too, you mentioned like bipolar versus BPD or borderline personality disorder. And I think it's interesting too, because many people are misdiagnosed as bipolar when it's borderline personality disorder. So the awareness of like, they're not always understood. Either diagnosis, I think, is misunderstood in a lot of places.
It is. And I think like, I'm sure we could spend an entire episode on like social media's impact with mental health and experience. Because I see a lot like, so I have a love-hate relationship with like mental health TikTok or therapy talk, right? Because like so much of it's really great. Like a lot of it has, as somebody who has a lot of autistic features, who would consider myself self-diagnosed autistic. However, I have imposter syndrome about it. And I'm like, but maybe I'm not. But there's this list and this validation from other autistic people that I've gotten that says that this is most likely what I'm experiencing. But I see a lot out there that's just like, oh, like this is what, autism is. And then I like look at that and I'm like, yes, it could be, but actually this may ring more true with like ADHD, or this rings more true with this thing. And there's that confusion. Like people come in and they're ready to self-diagnose and to say, oh my gosh, I have this thing. And I'm like, well, you don't. Like when people tell me like, oh, I'm bipolar, well, tell me what it is that you feel kind of led you to that conclusion. And I hear people say, like, I have mood swings. I can go from, angry to sad, like in 1 second. And so I rapid cycle throughout the day. And so that's a very real experience. And I don't ever try to take away from that experience.
For sure. Yeah.
But that experience is not best described by rapid cycling bipolar disorder,
Exactly.
which is very, very different.
Right. And that's what I think, we can do with the DSM is help educate, do psychoeducation, help them understand, especially when they come in and say, like, I think I'm this because I saw it on the internet. The other thing that I see a lot is a lot of people with adults with ADHD who are misdiagnosed as bipolar, and being able to like, because in my practice we have psychiatrist too, and like reach out to the psychiatrist and say like, hey, I noticed that this is their diagnosis, but this is the way that I think that they've fit ADHD more, and then being able to do an ADHD assessment. A lot of times find out, guess what? All this time you haven't had bipolar. You've had ADHD like your entire life.
It's wild when people like finally get validation of all of their experiences.
Yes.
Like I see not to dwell on TikTok, but I see a lot of folks be like, I've never had a unique, experience because everything that I see on TikTok is something I've experienced. And I thought that was unique or weird. And I think that that's great. And so finding again, like that name to it, that community to it is great.
Right. Name and community and understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and having that, like, I don't know, taking back the language is like a big thing of, taking back like the negative stigma with certain things and kind of more making it, empowered. And I think of,
yes.
even divisions within the community. So like to loop back to autism. So some people hate that it's become autism spectrum disorder. I get a lot of, I did something where I did some education and things like that with a larger group of people. And I talked about how, well, this is going to be controversial. I talked about how like the puzzle piece is, based when organizations that aim to cure autism, and most autistic people don't want to be cured. They just want people to understand. And I think about when some people got really mad. I got a lot of nasty grams when I said like, Asperger's is rooted in eugenics. Like it comes from a Nazi doctor. Like that's where that term came from.
You're right. The term is problematic. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. But I understand some people want to hold on to it. And I would never try to change someone's description of their own self. But I think too, a lot of that may be internalized shame about what it means to be autistic. And it becomes like, well, I'm only baby autistic, right? I think that's that self-shelter of, no, I can't be this thing.
Right. I mean, they have like the levels, but like the levels aren't in the DSM. So that's again, like, that's like if someone's only going by the DSM and trying to diagnose, I think that's why a lot of adults, and there are more and more adults getting diagnosed with autism as we get more of an understanding of what it is. But still, I think because people's idea, and especially if you look at the medical side or psychiatric side, they don't understand autism because you can't medicate it. So like when you're thinking about those things, there is a lot of misunderstanding because it's not in the DSM a way that people can understand without there being Asperger's, which I understand is a problematic term, but I think it did give some people some understanding who can't understand it if it's in the spectrum of autism.
True. I think though, when even people hear spectrum, they think of a linear spectrum.
For sure.
They don't realize it's these spheres, right? So it's this, what's the severity? And by severity, I think that's also misunderstood, but I'm going to use the word severity for this brief example of like, how much do you experience, these autistic traits when it comes to, making social bonds? How much do you experience it when it comes to special interests? How much do you experience it? Each of these kind of defining features of autism, each of those are to different levels. And when we talk about severity, because we talk about like, oh, like they must be only mildly autistic.
Right.
That's really shame-based, because really that says that that person is just like hiding it better, or they're more attuned to what they should and shouldn't do, as
Masking,
opposed to rate the versus rate the internal feeling of each of those traits.
Yeah, it's interesting because we could have, I think probably, and maybe we will have a whole episode about like masking and autism and like what that means and what it means to like take off a mask. And like you mentioned, I think ABA therapy and autism, and when you look at like, and I think you and I have different points of view on that as well. So that'll be an interesting topic for us to talk about.
We do, and I have a different experience with ABA therapy that I think is like maybe controversial in that, and so I definitely think we can probably make a whole episode on that.
We probably should do that. And I've been trained in ABA therapy and did it for a couple of years. So yeah,
absolutely.
But I still see benefits.
DJ, Well, yeah. Okay. So we have to make a whole different episode
We do
next.
have
We
to
can
have
keep
a whole
going for a
episode.
while. I
Yeah.
think there's so much to talk about. And I'm so glad that everybody was able to tune in and become a part of our conversation. Please engage, whether that's like, subscribe, leave that review, all of those lovely, lovely YouTube or podcast phrases. And I'm excited to continue demystifying therapy and talking about what your therapist really thinks about.